What we have on the bench today is this Tichy Trains Group Flatcar kit that I put together and I painted and lettered for, if you can see that, the Maryland and Pennsylvania. It's number 110. So as I mentioned in the introduction video to the What's on the Bench series, this is a great kit. It went together really well. I really like the result. However, one of the problems is this weighs nothing. So I've had a lot of problems with keeping it on the track. And I did solve part of that by realizing that I had both of these trucks were just a tad too tight. I thought when I tightened them up they were loose enough, but in fact they were not. Because of the very light weight of this, we need to make sure that there's literally no resistance to those turning. So once I did that, I've run this around the loop now quite a number of times without any issues, whereas before it would constantly derail. So that was a big improvement, but I still want to add a little bit more weight to it. I also want, so I'm going to do that in the form of a load, but I also want that load to be removable. So in thinking about what my options were, one of the things I came up with is some long timber logs that are ultimately going to look something like this. So what I plan to do is I took a bunch of barbecue skewers that I got off of Amazon and I cut them down to about 32 to 35 HO foot length. So you can see here I've got a whole bunch of those that I have cut. So I'm going to show you how I turned this into that. And then from there, I'm going to show you how I plan to actually mount these within the car so that they are a removable load, so that I can have the car transition from loaded to empty and actually have the load come in and out. So give me a minute and I'll let you reset the camera and I'll show you how I'm doing turning these bamboo skewers into something that looks a little bit more like a wood pole. So the first thing I want to do is give these a little bit more grain texture. So I'm going to take a couple of different razor saws and I'm going to just use these to drag down and try to put some grain. And I'm giving a little bit of a twist to the skewer as I'm doing it to try and put a little more character into it, not have them just look like, I drug a saw blade down them. So, and then I generally take one with a wider or a coarser tooth, and if I can figure out where the camera is, and I use that one. I give just a couple of passes with that one as well. Okay, so again I start with the finer tooth saw, giving a little twist as and hopefully once we get the stain on it, we'll be able to actually see the results. Okay, and I'll take my coarser one and give it just a couple of drags. Alright, so once I go through and I do all those, the next thing that I do is I grab some steel wool and I just use that to basically sand it down without risking without using sandpaper, so I don't really have to worry too much about sanding away the grain I've just added, but this gets rid of all the fuzz. I don't know if you can see it here on the bench, but I've got just a ton of the material that's come off from this, scraping the grain into it as well as sanding it down or steel wooling it. So the next thing I do is I've taken some apple barrel nutmeg brown, and then I've mixed that with a fair amount of water. There's still a fair amount of paint consistency. It's a little bit thicker than a wash, but not as thick as the paint straight out of the bottle. And then I just use that and I just paint. I paint it on liberally because the bamboo doesn't take the paint like a stain well, so you actually have to paint it. But I try to then make sure I'm brushing off any of the excess. I don't want a big glob of paint, which having the paint thinned helps accomplish that. Make sure you paint the ends as well.
So I'll go through, paint the entire thing. Oops, let me grab the other one here. This kind of painting is right up my alley because it doesn't require any artistry skill at all. It's just slap the paint off and then wipe it off a little, brush it off to make sure you don't leave too much behind.
Once it does dry, I'll go through and just touch it up if necessary. Make sure I've got a solid coating of the brown paint on there. And of course my fingers are wiping it off. And let me let those dry, and as soon as those are dry, I'll show you the next step. Okay, while the camera was off, I actually took the heat gun and used that to speed up the drying process. If you don't have a heat gun, you can use just a hair dryer. So I've got these ready to go. So now the next step is I'm going to use some India ink and alcohol, and I've got a fairly strong mixture here. This will help if I'm showing you what I'm doing. Just get in there. And then I'll take it out, set it on a paper towel, dump the next one in. Alright, we'll just let that dry for a minute. Actually, I'll give it a quick pat. While this is still wet, but hopefully you'll be able to see the black, the India ink really helps highlight the grain structure that we've put into it. So, and that's all it takes to turn the bamboo skewer into a wood log. So I'm going to go off and finish doing all the rest of these, and as soon as I get that done, I will come back and we'll start turning these logs into a load. Okay, so I went ahead and I finished staining all of the bamboo skewers. As you can see here on the bench, what I did in order to build the load to fit in the Flatcar, because I didn't want to glue anything while it was in the Flatcar, took the longest one of my logs, which I know fit inside there, and I built a little form here on the mat, taped it down, these two skewers here to give me the maximum width, then set my longest 8, because 8 is how many will fit across the, fit in the bottom of the Flatcar. I took the longest 8 and spaced them, trying to give them a little bit of, randomness, not all up against one edge or the other. And I've taped it down. And now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use some full strength white glue, and I'm just going to glue these down. And this will ultimately be the bottom of the load. Okay, this is what will sit up against the bottom of the Flatcar. So I'll just. And this isn't really going to be what gives it the full structural strength. This is just to hold this together, because then what I'm going to do, I want to be able to remove the load using a magnet, something like this here. I'm going to take some washers and I'm going to set them in here, and I'll epoxy these to the bottom here, and these will be set such that they'll actually across. It's also going to give it some weight. So I'm going to let this dry, and then I will come back after it's dry. We'll go ahead and epoxy on the washers, and then we'll flip this over and we'll build the top side of the load. So give me a minute and I will be right back. Okay, everything is mostly dry, so I'm going to go ahead and take it off and we'll do a test fit. And one thing I forgot to mention is that I stuck this little piece of wax paper underneath so that I could make sure that I didn't accidentally glue the logs to the mat, but it turns out it didn't stick at all, so good to go. Alright, so let's take this off. Okay. Alright, so there we go. Now let's click test fit. There we go. Alright, good. We're good to go. Should fits in there. So now the next step is I'm going to mix up a little bit of 5-minute epoxy, some 2-part epoxy. Alright, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to, I guess put on camera would be helpful. I'm just going to put a little bit of epoxy here. And I'm going to set that down just a slightly off center. Making sure that it's not extending beyond the logs themselves to make sure that it'll then fit back into the car. And then I will put a little bit on this guy. And again, making sure. Want to get every log epoxy to one of the washers, but making sure, and since the washers aren't wide enough to cover them all, I'm offsetting the two to get total coverage. Let me let that set up, and when it gets dried, we'll come back and we'll do one more test fit into the car. Now that the glue should be dry enough that we can give it a test fit, or a test tryout with the magnet. So let's put it in. And you can see that with the magnet I am able to pull the load out. So now the next step, I'm going to just take, actually while the camera was off before, I went ahead and glued together the second row of logs, and so now I'm going to just glue them in there right like that. So that'll be the next step, and we'll be able to call it complete. So one more quick pause and we'll be back with the finished product. So here we have the final result. So I think it looks okay, you know, for a quick and dirty little load. One problem I ran into is that this particular little magnet that I'm trying to use here is not quite strong enough. However, fortunately I have a stronger magnet here that will actually lift it out, no problem. So last thing to do is see how she runs.